Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. This is the presentation of my research proposal titled Characterization of Historical Tsunami Sources of the Maule segment using the logic tree approximation, geological observations, and probabilistic analysis methods. This work is supported by Fondesit and the Scientific Initiative Millennium. So what we are going to see, it is first the motivation and a brief introduction, then the hypothesis and goals of this work, a description of the methodology, the work plan, and finally the expected results. So to begin, I'd like to talk about the importance of characterization of historical tsunami sources. And I put this slide from Bigny et al. Because it says that comparing the 2010 Maule megatrust earthquake rupture with earlier events is important for seismic hazard assessment, but the lack of precise information about some past events requires caution. And we believe that this is the most important thing, the need of precise information about some past events, because through the characterization of historical tsunami sources or historical events, we can understand the long-term seismic cycle, and in consequence, we can improve the territorial planning in the sense of seismic hazard and risk assessment. So I show you this figure from Ruiz and Madariaga because these red lines represent some of the few megatrust earthquake events that we know from the past, along by these geographical coordinates, of course, and also represents the rupture length of each event. So as we can see, there are not so many and we don't know so much about them, but historical records can help us to achieve this work. And the events to characterize are presented in the right list. It can be noticed that, for instance, the 1730 and the 1960 events are, even when they have impact on the Maule segment, its epicenters do not belong to this. It belongs to the Valparaíso and the Valdivia segment, respectively. So they are not considered in the list. Also, we have one event in red, which is the 1570, as a result of an ongoing Mapuche communities uprising in the area. We do not know very well the earthquake effects or even the rupture length, but what we do know is that this event occurred in the Maule seismic segment, so it will be one event to characterize. Now, let's see, why do I say the Maule seismic segment? Well, the Maule earthquake occurred on February the 27th in 2010 with a moment magnitude of 8.8. And this seismic segment had a high seismic couple degree and hence a high seismic potential, which is what we can see in this figure from Moreno et al. 2012, where the darkest zones represents, This darkest zones represents precisely the largest seismic slip were recorded. And also this event closes a seismic gap from more than 100 years, initiated by the Darwin earthquake. And it is the first event, gap filling event monitored by the GPS station. So its deformation, it is very well known because of this. Now I want to show you the hypothesis of this work. First, we have that the most probable sources of historical tsunamis occurring in the Maule segment can be estimated with the logic tree approach, combining different source parameters, constraints from theory of characteristic earthquakes and observations from literature allow to limit the solutions to realistic or probable realizations of the models. So when I talk about combining different source parameters, I mean parameters such as the magnitude, the northern and southern limits, the fault length, and the fault width. And when I talk about observations from literature, I mean the coastal uplifts and subsidence deformation process, the tsunami wave height, and inundation, between others. Then we have that the quantification of uncertainties in the solutions can be modeled with probabilistic analysis methods to give an idea of the range of possible tsunamis in the Maule subduction segment. And last, the models obtained allow an inter-event analysis to understand the key aspect that controls the seismic cycle in the segment. About the goals and objectives of this work, the general objective is to characterize the sources of historical tsunamis in the Maule segment using the logic tree approximation, the physical and observational constraints, in order to perform a comparative analysis between earthquakes focused on the study of possible patterns in the seismic cycle. In the specific objectives, we have bibliographic compilation from different historical events in the segment and the creation of the logic tree branches. Use the logic tree approach to characterize historical tsunamis and obtain the source models parameters associated with each event. Simulate tsunamis generated by different source models for each historical earthquake to obtain tsunami heights and compare with observations. Apply probabilistic analysis methods to evaluate hazard curves in historical tsunami subduction zones. And last but not least, to study the correlation between events to define possible patterns in the seismic cycle or even earthquake supercycles. So we have seen where, we have seen why. Now let's see how are we going to get this characterization. This will be by adapting the logic tree methodology for past events. This algorithm performs the combination of several parameters to generate random sources from perturbations in a base source. The scheme above is an example for the 1960 event made by Fuentes, who is also part of this Fondesit project, and it can be noticed that the creation of branches and nodes comes from perturbations of different earthquake parameters, which converge in different fault solutions. So we have parameters such as the magnitude, the moment ratio, which is the ratio between the fault large and width, the northern and southern limits, and complexity, which is a measure of the amount of slip variation between contiguous fault. And in order to know which of these realizations are more probable, the models must be subjected to different filters, which in this case will be called the constraints. This part of the work is developed in details by Rodrigo Cifuentes, who is in charge of the logic tree code and programming this. And on the other hand, in the scheme below, we can see a chronology of different methodologies for the generation of random source used in seismology. So we can see that at least from 2002, this kind of methodologies for the random source generation has been used in seismology. And in 2007 and 2015, the Japaneses Anaka and Fukutani used the logic tree approach for probabilistic tsunami hazard analysis and its application to the Japanese coast, and then for stochastic analysis and uncertainty assessment of tsunami wave height using a random source parameter model that targets a Tohoku fault. So what about the constraints I mentioned above? We have two main types of constraint. We have first the physical, where we have two subtypes, the empirical relationships, such as relationships between seismic moment and area, which is what we can see in this box, the seismic moment and average slip in this one, and finally the moment magnitude and fault large centered in this last box. Then we have in the physical constraints also, we have the slip smoothness condition, which is about avoiding abrupt changes in the slip magnitudes for a set of contiguous fault. Then on the other hand, we have the observational constraints, such as historical we have, for instance, the letters, stories, writings, and also the use of this for earthquake studies. And then in the geological observations, we have vertical deformation process, the study of the atoms, and the study of paleotsunami deposits. So as an example of the available information for historical records, we have an illustration of the individual flood levels for some events mentioned above, obtained from Stewart et al. 2019. This reconstruction is made from historical data from letters, reports, and contemporary court cases. The slide shows the flood levels for 1570 and 1657 events, and the red circles represent the data point locations where there is information available. But also there are blue circles where we had information that the tsunami didn't arrive at these points. So in the first case, for the 5070 tsunami source, two first-hand chronicles and a series of letters and reports document what occurred during the earthquake and tsunami, and also in the weeks and months that followed. Furthermore, several 17th and 18th century historians used now non-existent sources to describe the earthquake and the tsunami's destruction. Similarly, for the 1657 event, there are not only first-hand reports, chronicles, and letters, but a series of posterior court cases centered around the city's irregular reconstruction process, allowing to pinpoint about 37 locations within the city that experienced earthquake damage. Time for water. Okay. So in the same way, we have the flood levels for the 1751 and 1835. In the first case, for the 1751 event, the tsunami generated is one of the longest generated in central Chile in the last 5 centuries, according to Ruiz et al. And the uplift processes resulting from the earthquake were detected through paleoseismological evidence, presuming a rupture length of more than 600 kilometers, according to Eli et al. In the case of the 1835 event, there are some information based on reports from Darwin and Fitzroy, who also used witnesses' reports to describe the effects of this earthquake. And finally, we have the 2010 flood levels, which is used by Stewart to contrast the historical event reconstructed. So here we have an example of the, Here we have an example of the compilation of geological observations from Quesada et al. And we can see that we have information of the vertical deformation for events like the 1751, the 1835, the 1928, and the 2010. Each observation has its location associated. And here in this figure, we can see an example of the depositional environment, such as the high marsh, upland, brackish lagoon, low marsh, or tidal flood, represented by each stratigraphic unit. So to sum up, the methodology can be divided in 3 main stages. First, we have the source generation, which is all about obtaining combination of source models with the logic tree code implemented by fuentes, and sleep distributions, which will be calculated with Python packages based also on Agava. And then we have the tsunami propagation and coastal inundation, which will be modeled with CompCode version 1.7. And here there is an example of propagation model with CompCode based on the 1751 earthquake. So about this software, about CompCode, this software uses finite difference for solving shallow water equations, nested grid system for the modulation, and the elastic theory of finite failure plans, also with a friction coefficient of 0.025. Besides, we are going to work with 4 levels of grids, shown in this list, with their respective resolution. In the case of 1 and 2 levels, it can be obtained from models as Itopo1 and ASRTM30. And in the case of 3 and 4, the bathymetry is obtained from SHOA data and the topography from ASTER, Advanced Spaceborne Thermal Emission and Reflection Radiometer. And all these data are handled with generic mapping tools. Finally, the fault parameters are obtained with the SLAP model 2.0 from Hayes et al. Well, the next stage, which is the earthquake analysis, This part is about the models comparison with historical records, the geological observation, and also about selecting probable sources by using a probabilistic analysis based on the cumulative distribution function. And then the last part is the inter-event analysis, which is about grouping the events according to their depth domains, comparative analysis between events, the study of supercycles in the segment, and the study of ancestors of large earthquakes. And also I left this question mark in here because it is still part of the challenge to improve this stage for the methodology. But now let's talk a little bit about the information available for this last part of the methodology, the inter-event analysis and the seismic cycle. Well, currently the study of recurrence patterns in the seismic cycle has coined the term supercycle of earthquakes, where we seek to find long-term patterns for a set of discrete events. In this way, Philip Ocean proposes a classification according to the type of rupture, as can be seen in this left box. So for instance, we have first the quasi-periodic similar ruptures, which is as the fault segment is likely homogeneous, it behaves as a single asperity and is subject to a simple cycle of strain accumulation and release. Well, then we have the clustered similar ruptures, which indicates period of accelerated strain release in which each earthquake releases only part of the available potential energy. Then we have the clustered complementary rupture, which is analogous to case A in terms of energy implications, except that strain is released in a series of earthquakes rather than a single one event. But in this case, the cluster complementary rupture, there are no evidence for the South American megatrust. Then we have the superimposed cycles, which occur when there are two or more families of events that involve the same fault, indicating that hazard in the region will depend on both cycles or more cycles, depending on the quantity. Well, in the same review, Philip Ocean used this figure where we can see the presence of possible persistent barriers between the limits north and south of the Maule segment. So a question is, can our methodology check for the existence of these barriers? So here we can see these yellow lines, the persistent barriers in the limits of the Maule segment. Well, and on the other hand, there are another key factors that defines the dynamics of the seismic cycle as shown in this right box. So several recent studies have focused on understanding how is the segmentation process, a structural and frictional control in a zone, as well as classifying the events according to depth domains. So we believe that from all this information, the models obtained in the results can be studied from this approach, in order to complement the current knowledge of recurrent patterns in the Maule seismic segment. Well, and here there is a figure to explain these depth domains obtained from Ley et al. 2012. So there are 4 domains defined. First, we have the domain A, which is a portion of the megatrust less than 15 kilometers below the ocean surface, the region of tsunami earthquakes. Then we have the domain B from about 15 to 35 kilometer deep where large earthquake displacement occurred. We have then the domain C, which extends from about 35 to 55 kilometer deeps. And finally, we have the domain D, found at depth of about 30, 50, 45 kilometers in subduction zones. So now let's see the work plan. I divided the year in 2 semesters, from March to July and from August to December. In the first one, I expect to develop the bibliographic compilation of historical records and geological observations. I left about 2 months for this, as well as the creating the logical tree branches. Then from April to May, we have the simulations and strain calculations. And the final part of this semester will be the model selection based on the constraint I mentioned about. And I take this part could take some time, so that's what I left about 3 months for this. Then we have the second semester. And in this period, I expect to be working on the analysis on the event analysis using probabilistic methods and in the inter-event analysis. Well, about the writing, I expect to be working on this the whole year, at least 1 or 2 weeks per month. So finally, I'd like to talk about the expected result. So I have divided this part in the earthquake individual analysis and the inter-event earthquake analysis. Well, in the first part, we expect to obtain realistic models with heterogeneous slip sources according to available observations, and also characterizing historical events with heterogeneous models allow to understand the behavior of possible future events. Then we expect to recognize maximum slip patch location for each event, and also the segmentation along a strike and along dip based on the classification of depth domains that I mentioned before. So in this figure, we can see the fault models obtained a priori with the available information from NOAA. So it is very common that for historical events, the epicenter is considered just where we have the worst damages caused by the earthquake. But we know that this information is not always representative, and the places with the worst damages are not always the epicenter of an event. So this is something that we expect to clarify about these historical events, and also with a heterogeneous slip model, we avoid the underestimation of the arrival time and the overestimation of the amplitude of a tsunami, according to Callisto et al. 2016. Well, and in the same way, classifying the events according to depth domains allow to recognize the accumulation of energy in different portions of the Maule segments. For instance, we can see in the same figure that the central south area of the segment has had the majority of the megatrust events, but in the northern portion, there is only one, the 1928 event. And if we are capable of classifying the depth of this event, we could talk about projections such as, is there an accumulation of energy in the shallower or deeper northern area of the segment? Or is this part more probable to produce a megatrust event in the future? Now, about to the spectral results for the inter-event earthquake analysis, we expect to recognize through this methodology and characterization of historical tsunami sources the accumulation of energy in shallow or deep portions of the Maule megatrust, based on studies of Carvajal et al. 2017. Also, to test the capability of determining the recurrence interval of ruptures in shallower or deeper portions in the segment, also along a strike and along dip. And finally, to correlate the heterogeneous rupture process with seismicity or even the couple degree. So here there is part of the work in progress. We have some tables for the 7051 event where we have information about the vertical deformation process. For instance, in this column, we can see uplift or subsidence. And in the case of having minus 1000, it means there is a subsidence process. We have the location and the geographical coordinates, also the source where this information was taken. And in case of having a positive 1000, it means that there is uplift in the location. Well, same thing for the 1835 event. We have so much information, but I didn't have enough space for this. And also for the 2010 Maule earthquake, the same thing about the vertical deformation. So, well, here there are some references, and thank you so much for your attention.